sorts of things, including Jews and the British and the British Jews and the British slave trade. Uh, some of that work was done on this veranda. There are people who came here. I absorbed a lot of that stuff. You're getting it back now trying in a fairly condensed version. How do I end up with genealogy? Simply, in the back of the Birmingham book is a family called the Pereira Mendes family. That's the first family, that's a major family in North American Sephardic Jewry. Big deal. I do know from another source that I am a descendant of a Pereira Mendes family. Lo and behold, 1 o'clock one morning, I discovered that I am descendant from the same family. Or they are descendants from thy family. Which way you want to look at it.
Right.
I discover famous rabbis coming out of Amsterdam, which are the ancestors of my mother. My mother never knew anything further back than her grandfather. She knew nothing more than who her grandfather was and her grandmother. And that's the story of most people. When you are a colonial society that were told that you were English and that the English were everything to you. And the English didn't have a clue about what your history was because you didn't come from England. I'm a white-looking person, and when people ask me which part of England I came from, I tell them I'm neither English, Irish, Scottish, or Welsh. So what are you?
You're a Jamaican Jew.
Exactly.
What are you?
Right, exactly. You got it right. You got it right. So it's a whole story that is coming together.
I just didn't know if he went to different places to check,
No, well, I mean, yes,
National Library.
national libraries, but there was no body.
Doing is getting bits of information from
Yeah.
all over the place
So
and then put it
we
together.
both went to both of the major international conferences.
So
John Carter Brown Library has an amazing collection of West Indian history. You find a piece here and I find a piece there in the John Carter Brown Library. You go to the National Library down here. In our archives is where we found the Charles II document.
Really?
Yeah. Because our National Library here, our records, our archives go back to the 1660s. So I wasn't really talking to you at this stage.
No, it's okay. We're rolling also just to have the information.
But so, Fran,
so
the story is, it's a coalescing of information and interpretation, which is why I mentioned earlier, I'm a revisionist historian. Anybody thinks I'm a historian is not true. I'm a revisionist historian. I have picked up things which people have said in corners and been able to put them together logically, and that they make sense and they hang together and they're really, I think, legitimate. So, coming back to New Seville, Sevilla Nuevo, and the fact that Columbus lived on that site, and then his son Diego founded the first village, or city, or town, or whatever, township here. Was Diego Columbus a son of a converso? Who knows? I could tell you that, this is the first Jewish town in Jamaica. That's bullshit.
It was written that Cohen, in his older age, gave up his piracy when Henry Morgan became the lieutenant governor of Jamaica and pardoned his longtime friend. The two of them lived their days out in Jamaica, and that was...
Okay, that's very important. We know Henry Morgan died here. Hans Sloane was his doctor. Hans Sloane. You been in London? Sloane Square. Hans Sloane. British Museum was founded by Hans Sloane on his Jamaican collection. You tell an Englishman that it was a Jamaican botanical collection from Hans Sloane that founded the British Museum, they'll tell you two bad words. But it's true. That's how it was founded. That's the importance of Jamaica. It's fascinating. Okay. Don't start me with that because I'll start to tell you about Joseph Banks and the breadfruit and Horsted and Co. So, the Jewish story was never put together by the English historians and even by the West Indian historians, because most of the West Indian historians in the latter days of my life, because the university was founded in 1948, were looking more at the exploring and importantly what enslavement and what slavery was all about and how it related to the economy and to people and da. Okay. So we fast forward now, we come to where we start to think about Jamaican genealogy, who we were, etc., how we settled, where we settled, our 21 Jewish cemeteries, who were the names, what is the present what is the present situation, where did we migrate to? You know, the girl that wrote the poem for the, anyway, she wasn't Jamaican. I was thinking to do the negative, but anyway, we became fairly important source of people that settled in America before the 1820s, which was when the Germanic and then subsequently the Eastern European Jewish migration took place. We were there before. That's why Stephen Birmingham called the book The Grandees. Because I can tell you, and I'm proud to boast, and tell you that my ancestors were eating with knives and forks off plates and drinking out of silver cups before the British had learned to use a knife. They only used to tear their food with their hands. Fitzroy, you understand I'm talking about your ancestors?
I understand exactly. I hear them. So, okay, and one last...
That's why we had the Grandees.
Well, two questions
Last
was...
question.
Well, no, all right, you're right. One question is, we're going to go to Hunts Bay. That cemetery has Hebrew writing on it, and there's actually skull and bones, and there is several people from this time. Tell me a little bit about Hunts Bay. Why is Hunts Bay so important, or who's buried in Hunts Bay, and what we can find there? And I'll just give you a heads up. It's like what you told me yesterday when we were just at the memorial. You have Jewish writing, you have Hebrew, you have Portuguese, you have skull and bones, you have children that are buried. Yesterday was a memorial. Now when we go to Hunts Bay, the cemetery, what will we find there?
You're going to find what's left.
We'll say we're going to Hunts Bay and we'll find out.
And what you're going to find, what's left is, in fact, not all that was there. Hunts Bay was abandoned. Hunts Bay, the earliest inscribed tombstone is 1672. And the family name is Gabai. I've taken a Gabai there. My friend is a president of Mikveh Israel in Philadelphia, the oldest Sephardic congregation in that part of the country. And he says, you see, my ancestors are from here. He was happy. You've heard of the Touro Synagogue? And Rabbi Isaac Touro is buried in Hunts Bay. So you understand the connectivity, the movement of people. It tells that story which never was told before. So you're going to see some of that. There's a grave in there which we think could be Moses' wife. Moses Henriquez's wife, okay? We don't have any record of Moses being buried there. But then we have to remember that a lot of the marble and a lot of the tombstones were used in the houses that used to be around it, possibly for flooring, possibly in the garden, possibly wherever, I don't know. So tombstones were taken. So I can't tell you that everything was there. We have a register of those that were seen there in the 1950s, and then we did a subsequent registry and have compared the registration that we found when we opened up the cemetery. I opened up the cemetery 12, 13 years ago for the first time. It had never seen a machete to clean the bush. When I first went in there, we were hopping from tombstone to tombstone with the prickle bushes all around and blah blah blah.
What made you go there? What did you learn about it? And you said, "I'm going to come to look."
No, I knew it was there.
This.
I knew it was there.
It was in your heart to say, "I need to clean this up."
Yes. Well, I've been to all the Jewish cemeteries, and I've been responsible for, and I've been there. And Marjorie and I went there.
Responsible for what? Tell me.
cleaning a lot of them.
No, you need to
You
say,
say
you know,
it says
as such and such, I am responsible. Or
I was the administrator for the congregation for years, decades and a half.
How many cemeteries there were and the
Yeah,
significance
yeah.
of Hunts Bay.
And Hunts Bay was one that we needed to tell the story. I mean, so we cleaned it. And,
what do you want?
well, okay, what do I want out of all?
Do you want this to be the opening of, again, Jewish history? The fact that Jews were always persecuted, and that the fact that now we can share and say, you know what? Yes, we were persecuted, but we also went out for revenge, and we fought, and we did this, and we survived, and like, you know, it's such a huge part of history,
No.
and moreover, Jewish history that needs to be told. So in my eyes, I'm saying, you know, kids need to know this. This should be taught in history in schools. This should be a part of the history that I know I didn't learn about in history class, like you said. Everybody knows the basics. They skip over to Columbus. They don't know anything about any more than the 3 ships. I'm talking elementary level of history. So, at what point do we start telling our children about Jewish pirates, about the Jews in the time of Inquisition, and the importance of Judaism, especially here in Jamaica? Because you and I know most people come to Jamaica. It's beautiful, it's lovely. We have Ocho Rios, you have Negril. But why should we make everybody know, like, this is a huge part of history? I want to say it's as big as going to Israel, because coming here and going into the synagogue is of such important part of history that people should see this as big as a trip to Israel.
Okay, I think I want us to move the idea of Jamaican Jewish history into a very positive mode. We have been persecuted. We celebrate emancipation from slavery in Egypt. We celebrate or recognize Inquisition and the death of our ancestors in Spain. We recognize the Holocaust, which took place in my lifetime. We don't celebrate it, we recognize it, and it's important that we do. Okay. Over 300 years ago, Jews were allowed to settle in Jamaica. Yes, we created efforts to be able to survive. Whether it was only revenge, no, it wasn't. It was also economic, it was a number of different things. It was also, I don't want to use the word miscegenation, but we became part of the community. And this has evolved to a very positive country. In this country, we recognize each other's right to believe as we wish. In this country, we recognize each other's ethnicity as being theirs. Not to be confused because you're black or white or Chinese or whatever. But we are one, effectively, as the motto says, we are one people. But more importantly, we're not only one people, but we're also one culture, regardless of our origins. So we now are telling a new story of humanity, where I am as comfortable in the Catholic Archbishop offices as I am in the synagogue offices where you saw me. I don't have a problem. I knock on the door and I walk right in. And this is not a problem, because you didn't go last night, but we had other people in the Hanukkah celebration last night. Okay, so they were welcome as anybody else. We've even had here one of the major prelates in the Anglican Church. His name is Cohen. His surname is Cohen. And I look at him and I said, "Are you my cousin?" He says, "I could be," because he recognizes his Jewish ancestry. And he's a black man. And he's an Anglican. And he's a highly respected individual. So that's part of it, okay? We have changed the dynamic of how humanity works. I'm very positive about this, and I think the history that we have uncovered helps to to reinforce this story. The Catholics know something of their story. The Moravians know something of their story. The Jewish story was not known. It's now known. Who are we? Check the DNA. Who is who? Who is what? Hundreds of thousands of Jamaicans have Jewish ancestry. Hundreds of thousands. Not because we were 3,000 or 4,000 people. Hundreds of thousands today of Jamaicans have Jewish ancestry. And that ancestry is mixed up with Taino, Indian, Chinese, African. And again, when we deal with African, I want every person with African blood in this country to know the tribe that they came from. Because Africa is 900 tribes, 900 ethnicities, theoretically, and cultures. Now, in the context of Judaism, we have the same problem. I am Sepharad, I'm Sephardi. But my grandmother is Ashkenazi, so my story to anybody is very simple. I'm cafe con leche. That means I have milk with coffee. No, I'm not saying that my grandmother was black or white. It has nothing to do with ethnicity. It just means that I am a mixture. That's really what it is. And I don't care whether she was black or she wasn't black. It's nothing to do with me. But this is our story Jamaica has to tell the world. And for me, telling the story that we emerged from piracy to survive and to become who we are today is what I believe in. So have I confused you? Yes.
No, I can't thank you enough, Ainsley. I'm done. I have nothing more to ask. I think you just
But
covered
just one
everything.
thing though, which you could add to the end of what you said there, which Karen was on.
Buddy.
Well, I want you to say that on camera.
Okay.
I
So-
want you to say that this history, the
needs-
Jewish history, the Jamaican history, the mixture thing, needs to be told, and people need to know it, especially children needs to know
even in early education.
early education, whether they're here in Jamaica or they're here
Should
in
be in the history
Israel
books.
or they're in Spain
Just a
or
part
in
of history
Portugal,
books.
they need to know this history.
Well, I think that really to come to the end of the story is that I really hope that each and every religion and ethnicity in Jamaica has enough understanding of who they are, and they can share that with all of the future generations, in the sense that we didn't know who we were as Jews because we never explored our history before. We can now share it with everybody else who has been exploring and now knows something more about their history, because in the final analysis, I think the Jamaican people are in fact an extraordinary set of people as a model of how human beings should live with each other in this world.
That's a good ending. Good
That's a
answer.
good ending.
And you're more confused now. than-
No, I'm not, because that,
You can't come to where we are if you
Wait,
didn't
say that
understand
again.
how
The pirate story, what? Say
Well,
it again, I want to
the
get
pirate story, as well as the Holocaust story, as the Inquisition story, as the Egyptian enslavement story, are where we need to understand to be able to come to where we are today. So the pirate story has to be told.
Thank you.
When he
Bravo.
dies, we're going to keep his brain
Thank you, sir.
and we're going to add probes to it.
Picture of you in your office because you work. You guys work together so closely. So we'll take a B-roll shot of you in his office. And I know that has to be a loss for you. It has to be. It's a best friend that you wrote all of this, and it's going to be a theatrical piece. You know, I'll be going down the aisle in a walking cart, you know, but I do believe in my heart of hearts that this is so important. And you spent so long in losing him, you know, it's hard, but hopefully we'll get this as a legacy,
Yeah, man.
you know? So that would be great. I mean, like I said, this will probably be the first of many. And then after this goes out, the big shots come in, and they do what they do, you know. But for me, for now, that's okay.
I think we have enough to keep it real.
This to one editor at home, the organization that wants to produce this, and I can guarantee you, these are the people that have been offering me proposals. I don't even have to edit it. I could just say, look at this interview with Ainsley. There's a million, and you too, there's a million visuals, a million stories that can be told. Somebody has to break it down. Just like the book. Somebody has to put it in chapters. That tells a whole story than the media. There
No,
isn't.
exactly.
But just about what's going on in the country. They have what's called free anxiety, free running anxiety. I say this, and he's very political and he's very well read, and his mother's 93, so she's been around a long time. And I say, this is not exactly, but very, very similar.
Yeah.
And that's what's happening
the
in
checks
America.
and balances we're hoping.
I can't lay a photo of that next to the camps. I can't. So it was you have to be very careful with history how you lay it out. Because the energy there too. You have to say this was going on, and where I turn around and say I don't really care that we just billions of dollars just went out to discover a little dot in the sky. Yes.
Come and show you something. Go on.
I'll come in.
Look at this. All of this actually good. There's a gully started when we buy the house. All of this is created. So we put in drain. And when it rains, like you hear the river. So this is a fascinating piece of land because the road also provides water in here. And all of them meet at the bottom of the garden. And we have a lower garden. So it's fun.
You have control on the water? Like you control the flow? No? Just free flow?
Just rain. That's the car. That's a dead end. It comes here. It comes through the other people's houses and goes out. And it's lovely when it's raining at night. You just get
These, what kind of trees?
This is called no.
I thought it's a coconut.
This is what do you call it? Screw pine. And it's spread into pieces. Mechanical barrier. I don't need fences.
No, I meant did you want
Yeah, a lot of people think the house ends here, don't they?
No, I saw those trees and I thought they're huge. They're so big.
Yeah, they're not trees.
What do I know? I thought it was like a coconut on the ground.
Yeah. That's a breadfruit tree.
Grapefruit?
Bread.
Oh, breadfruit. Is it like
Oh,
a
I
jack?
see them up there.
No. Breadfruit is a
Oh, red or bread?
bread, bread, B-R-E-A-D.
I think that's what was on the salad.
not their mothers were cousins.
These aren't coconut style.
It's beautiful.
For March
We're going to
next
have a
year.
very difficult
Why?
time going home,
Something
Fran and I.
I'm going to do a cold beach.
A cold beach. I'm going to.
And it was March next year. What's significant in March next year?
Okay, so this was here.
Ship went up.
You need to put back my. Oh, that chair come. Move around.
Okay. We can go into your room, your writing room. Fran. Let's just get him in the writing room before you guys are hungry.
No, we can get food on the way.
All right, you be the boss.
Where's the doctor?
All night we were trying to figure out. It's okay. We can't figure it out. And the taxi.
It's 1:30. It's 1:30.
Okay, all right.
So if it says
Okay, you go to the doctor already?
$5,000, then you divide it.
Okay, take that. Take that.
Yes.
Not 130.
One times it.
Oh, okay.
1/3.
So when you come and use,
Okay.
all right. So when you use the doctor, you use the money for the doctor. All right.
So you times and divide.
Oh, well, that's her, because I don't
All right,
have
so
time.
right, we're dividing the large one.
So you have my, the Nikon, right?
Right here.
All right, let's follow
Yeah, follow
Angie in.
And then you want to leave?
Yeah, let's.
Okay, Dave, you want the light?
Yeah.
Okay, you want me to ask you for it?
Okay. Oh,
Come guys.
It's like crazy.
This is where it's at.
this is what I imagined it would look like.
Your imagination is beyond imagination.
This is cool. This is really cool. Writing room.
So what you have are two desks. Marjorie sits there, I sit here, and we send emails to each other.
You could just pick up a book, Ainsley.
Let's pick up a book.
Any book, any book.
Any
you want.
book. This book will do. It's called The Jews of Jamaica.
Ah,
Tombstone Inscriptions.
oh wow. Okay.
You can skip the page.
You want that's my ketubah on the wall there.
Oh, okay. Yeah, you said you had it here.
Alright. Yeah. Yeah, look on the page, yeah.
coconut tree.
Oh, goodness. Your brother was older or younger?
Younger.
Oh. When did you lose him?
About 14 years ago.
Sorry.
That's my mother meeting the Queen.
Oh, my. And the reason for that? The occasion?
Her husband.
Is this?
Something like that. That's Norman Manley.
Oh, okay.
That is
That
a
wasn't
man
my
who.
Karen, my fault.
That's a man
I
who.
said, Karen, I think that might be it. During
No,
a
it's
conference.
Michael's father.
Ainsley,
Oh.
what photo? Oh, let me see that.
And Ainsley as a boy with his
I know
brother.
it's hot.
Because I'm now looking at engaging a photographer here to just darling don't ask me.
Oh, these are the books. So you and Ed worked up here. Wow.
We have this suite up here.
You good, David? It's so hot up here.
Nice
Let's
at
go.
night.
You're amazing too.
That's me.
Still there, it's still standing.
No light, no light. One light right there.
No light, no light, no light.
Yeah, walk them inside and look around. Stop. Walk past the camera. Walk past the camera. Alright. Alright, so walk from there and go in the room. Just turn around, come in the room now. Walk in the room now. Stop and look. Look around at this side. Look up on the image. Over up there. Yeah. Alright, look like you're taking down one of the book or something like that.
No.
Alright. Can put it back. Come over this side now. Next side. Over this side. Skip the pages. Skip the pages again. Skip the page one more time. Alright, keep looking on it. Keep looking down.
Hello, 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 yes. Habla español. You speak Spanish. You don't know English? Go ahead. Ainsley Henriquez. Good, good. Uh-huh. Thank Yes. Yes. Okay, you need the place that you're going to study. Have they given you any indication or anything in writing that you're going to be studying with them, or are you just studying on your own? I don't know much about what the Trinidadian visa story is. You don't need visas like Jamaica. Usually they limit you to 90 days. There's the same problem. I know him too. He's only the honorary consul like me.
Ainsley!
Okay, well, there's that's what you want to do and ask their advice. My advice is not
Where's Dave?
necessarily kosher. My advice is that you go to Israel, reserve
Alright, they can come back up now. Alright, stop.
I know.
Yeah, man. No, I want to go back when I want to go back up and that's actually just walk down and that's it. Action, ready. Okay, don't look at the camera, go down. That's it. Yeah.
Dave, come.
Yeah. Ready? Me the one man. Fritz, what are you doing in the shot, man? Mickey's move. Run. Move, no Fritz, man. Get the shot and done. Alright. Yeah, but thanks. Alright.
Fitzroy, isn't it your full name, Fitzroy?
Fritz, yeah, Fritz Roy. Yeah, it was originally Fritz, you know, and then my mom added the Roy. Her German friend named me Fritz, but she wasn't so happy with just the Fritz alone, so she added the Roy.
Okay.
But my name was originally just Fritz. And then
This is it?
yeah, we park here.
It said
Right
there's
here.
no clearing, like through the bushes.
Park beside. Go down to that opening there.
Oh my God.
Here. Look where you're stepping, yeah?
Okay.
Nearby. I can go this way.
Karen,
Yeah? Yeah, you want it, okay, you do whatever you think is best.
Okay, so we're looking for particular one.
Yeah, number 6.
So which side? Number 6, that's the way.
You know, the problem is, it could be any of these heads.
Yeah. Coming, coming.
How many days you shot for Dave? 3. Remember Karen saying you need to put your hips into it there.
This has some bone, rough bones, but no skull.
That's the one there's the anchor of those
so my name is a Portuguese name. It's a good Portuguese name because the first king of Portugal was a Henriques. So do I have Portuguese Jewish royal blood? I don't think so. Again, it's a whole question of, here again I bring the idea of genealogy into play, because we took names which were not Jewish names when we became conversos, when we were practicing Catholicism openly. And these stories are also very, very interesting and emerging tremendously importantly and in the United States and in some of the Latin countries, where we managed to go secretly as good Catholics. And now we're discovering that many of these families were in fact from Jewish converts, because they couldn't stay in Spain or Portugal. They would have been garroted in the Inquisition, in the Auto de Fe.
So when Columbus stumbled against, he wasn't exactly navigating to come to Jamaica. He accidentally came to Jamaica because of weather, or he was actually marooned here. This is my Fritz telling me this story.
This is,
But wait 1 second. Yeah. I do want to know, and in lay terms, I say, so why did Christopher Columbus care so much about the Jews, and why did he care so much about Jamaica, and why did he go and come back, and was there a treasure that he left behind for specifically the Jewish merchants to go and find? I'm confused. I want you to tell me.
He was marooned, they say.
Let Ainsley tell us.
No. The story of Columbus's 4 voyages are very interesting. I'm not an expert, but I do have a revisionist history approach to it. The expulsion order of 1492, signed by Isabella and Ferdinand, and probably written by Torquemada, was the expulsion of all Jews. No Jews were allowed in Spain, and eventually not in the Spanish New World. Some of the people who advised Ferdinand and Isabella after the capture of Granada, which was the unification of the Reconquista, which was what Spain became by kicking out the Moors and the Jews, was that story. That were Jewish financiers who put up money. And one of the very real problems they had was that the conversos of Spain wanted to make sure that their children were not going to be subject to the Inquisition. So we think that some of the backing for Columbus was to put young Jewish children, or children of conversos, onto boats to come to the New World. By then he had found the New World, because he didn't set out to go to the New World, he set out to go to the Indies, right? Why and how? Because I think the knowledge existed that Columbus had access to. One of the most important people was a man named Zacuto, who was a Jew, who had actually discovered how you traverse the world, that the world was not flat. So these are all part of issues which emerge in the further readings of what may have influenced Columbus. So he gets here. He comes here. He doesn't come to Jamaica on he doesn't arrive in Jamaica on the first voyage. He arrives here on the second voyage. And he doesn't stay here. He sails around the island. I came here in 1594, the first voyage. 1494. He comes back again on the last voyage, the fourth voyage. And he ends up where he first literally arrived, in the Jamaican harbors. Right. He can't leave. His 2 ships are worm-eaten and have to be grounded. And he lives on board one of the ships for a while, and then he lives on board, comes on the land, and he lived here for over a year. And he sent one of his people, Mendez, to Hispaniola, where there was an emerging small Spanish community, in a canoe sailed by the Taino. And they persuade the then governor of the small settlement in Santo Domingo to send a ship for Columbus. Did all his people leave? I can't tell you that. Did some stay and relate to the Taino people? That's possible. Was this a population that in fact also integrated with the early enslaved persons or servants coming from Africa who were here with the Spanish but didn't leave either? So there are all sorts of fascinating ethnical issues that have yet to be solved. So what happens is that Columbus stays here and eventually goes back to Spain. He's rescued after a year on 5 days, I think it is. And I know the site well because he was taken care of by the Taino people who had a village on the beach. And part of the way that he was able to get fed, he and his 100-odd crew, was because he knew when there was going to be an eclipse of the moon, of the sun rather, and he told them that he was going to turn the light out if he didn't get fed. And that's on a beach that I've walked many times. Quite exciting. So that's part of it. That has nothing really to do with practicing of Judaism and the religiosity and building of cemeteries, and synagogues and then cemeteries. But it's related in the broader sense of why we are here was because we were Jewish in Spain.
What it's all about. So that's why I want to say, which you mentioned is that certificate that was given for Moses Henriquez to actually go and find these treasures. Tell me what you told me regarding Jamaica being a safe haven, Moses coming back. Why was Christopher Columbus here with the treasures? Could he actually be Jewish? Explain that whole little scenario of Jamaica being a safe haven, Moses coming back, treasure, and Columbus. In your words.
We mentioned earlier that Columbus discovered the West Indies, the Caribbean. In fact, there were people living here. And one of the exciting things that I think we were involved with 500 years in the quincentennial anniversary was that we greeted the people who were here subsequently in the words of the people who were here before. So Columbus didn't discover Jamaica, the Jamaicans discovered Columbus. Okay, I like that because I think it keeps the relationships in the proper sequence. Was Columbus a Jew? I have seen information that indicated that he may in fact have been not from Genoa, but from Portugal. And one of the strong arguments is that would a Genoese been allowed on Portuguese ships, in merchant ships? That's a moot question that there are better people who have studied that than me to make the proper answer. What happened in Jamaica, in particular, not the rest of the Latin American countries, is that Columbus ended up owning the island. And interestingly, the Spanish never settled this island because it didn't have gold and silver. So there were only, at the time of the British capture, estimated to be no more than 2,000 people in the island. They were raising cattle and horses, and they were feeding these animals to the conquistadors. So it was never really a wealthy island. Some may argue it's still not, but that's another story. So what happens is that with the owning of the island by Columbus and his family until the English capture it, the Spanish never made a major Catholic church here, and there was no anything more than there was no bishopric, so there was no Inquisition. So again, we have the story that the English documentaries actually now proving that when they captured Jamaica, Penn and Venables, William Penn's family and Venables, they actually discovered two sets of people here: Spanish families and what they call the Portuguese families. Now, who are the Portuguese families? This is more than likely people who were known by the euphemism Portugals, which was a nice way of saying secret Jews. And the English actually wrote the letters to indicate to the crown in England that they didn't want to keep the Spanish, but they would keep the Portugals. So the fact of the matter is that, yes, whilst we can argue that there was no synagogue or no Jewish practice prior to the English, but for that 108, for 60 odd years or whatever it is, there more than likely would have been secret Jews living in Jamaica, but not necessarily certainly not openly practicing Judaism. So it's a whole other story which needs much more work to determine who these people are. And today we can probably even use DNA in some of what is the early Jamaican, basically African population, to determine whether in fact there is Sephardic Jewish bloodlines in their system, as well as the Taino, who are the original people. Because people mingle, people mix, and this is one of the fascinating aspects today of Jamaica.
Is it true, from what I understand, is that
Villa Nuevo, New Seville. Okay, and that was the first European settlement in Jamaica.
But did they relate that to Seville from Spain?
Well, that's where they came from.
No, but is that why they?
Sure. Sevilla Nuevo, because it's a New Seville. They're coming from Seville.
Yeah.
So let me ask you another question. So how did the people learn, or when did the Jewish people learn about pirates and pirateers? Did they know when it was actually happening? When Moses Cohen, Henriquez, I refer to him as that. When Moses was sailing, and was it something that word just got around that this is the pirate that's helping us, or let's join in, or like, did he have any support? Was it done so secretly that the Jewish people in Jamaica at that time had no idea, or was it a secret, and did he bring on more people to come along under secrecy and travel with him? So how did he navigate, I guess, spreading the word? How did he navigate spreading the word, and how did people trust him, or did he have to convince people to come along, or like, when did people start to realize about Moses and the works that he was doing?
When Eddie wrote the book.
So how come? There you go.
No,
How come
let me,
we
let,
don't
let me
know?
no. The point is, I think the interesting issue is how did the Jews learn to settle in the New World, and that comes with the capture by the Dutch of what became Dutch Brazil in the area around Recife in the 1620s, because the Jews were only allowed literally to live in Holland. So there was nowhere else in Europe. There was nothing else. There was no French. There was no English. There was any of the European empires or countries trying to settle in the New World didn't have Jews. So the Dutch then settled in Recife, and they became fairly successful in the 30 years there as sugar growers and everything else. And that's where Moses was, in Recife. The Portuguese recaptured Dutch Brazil in 1654. And one shipload of those Jews, 23 of them, were marooned in Jamaica. They got another ship. The Spanish still owned Jamaica, still controlled it, but it was not a major Spanish site. And that ship ended up in a place called Manhattan, the Dutch island of Manhattan. And I think you know where that is. And that were the 23 Jews who founded the first Jewish community in America. Okay, so what happens then is that the work.
Moses put 23 Jews on.
No, Moses didn't have anything to do with it.
Okay, so
No.
these 23 people.
The Dutch, the Dutch were kicked out of Recife,
Okay.
and the Dutch managed to persuade the Portuguese not to kill the Jews, and put them on ships and sent them out of Recife. Most of them went back, as we understand it, to Holland. One boatload came to Jamaica, but they couldn't stay because it was still Spanish. A year before the Spanish lost Jamaica to the English. And that boatload ended up in Manhattan, which was Dutch. And Peter Stuyvesant was persuaded, my argument is, by Jacob Henricus, the brother of Moses Henricus, to allow the Jews to stay there, because he persuaded it by writing the burghers of Amsterdam to be able to allow the Jews to stay in Manhattan. So that's part of the story. Okay, so did Moses send a telegram? No, there was no telegrams. He didn't use email, so it was word of mouth that all of these things happened, because what we were looking for was a place to live, a place to practice Judaism, nothing else. And to be able to practice Judaism in the way that we talked about earlier, with chutzpah, with revenge, with courage, so that we could survive.
And now tell me what I just said to you, and you said in one sentence. So, so why do we? Why? How did I learn about Jewish pirates? You just told me. How do we know about this now? And you mentioned Ed in the book. So tell me what happened. How was this book written, or how do I know? I'm sitting here. How do I know about Jewish pirates?
Well, let us also recognize that by early 1700s, Jamaica was the largest Jewish community in the New World, in the Americas, because of the prosperity that came out of sugar and slavery. So, the history that has been researched in countries like Jamaica and where there was slavery was based on sugar and slavery, not on Jewish history. So we then end up with a fellow called Edward Kritzler, who was an amateur historian, and for 20 odd years whilst he lived here, decided that the Jewish history of Jamaica was something he wanted to enter into. There was nothing before except for the work of Mordecai Arbel, who was my mentor. So, Ed then discovers the story of Moses Henricus. And Ed and I and Derek, a friend of ours, also no longer with us, found initially the story of the Henricuses arriving in Jamaica, I think it was 1668, with the document from Charles II that allowed them to look for the Columbus gold mine. And that led Ed to continue the research that uncovered the elements of piracy and privateering and buccaneering, etc., that we are talking about today with Moses as the premier buccaneer, so to speak. And behind you is a room where Ed wrote a lot of his book. And it was really exciting because we spent many, many, many years and many, many, many hours on this veranda where we were talking about it to encourage him. And my wife was a particularly important element of encouraging Ed to write the book. And the Jewish Pirates of the Caribbean, I think I can safely say, was born on this veranda.
And now?
So, that's the story of that. It has resonated also because subsequently, over the last 2 decades, we've had 2 major conferences on Jewish history of the Americas or the Caribbean. And that's also been documented and written, and textbooks exist. So it's no longer a hidden story.
So on that note, what would you love to see come out of this this documentary, this story that we're sharing? If you could tell me a few things that you personally want out of this. Do you want this book to be shared in synagogues? Do you want this to be a part of Jewish history? Do you want this to be taught in schools? Do you want this? Tell me in your deepest heart's desire, what is it that you want to relay? If you could say just a few sentences.
So to add to Ed's work on the Jewish pirates, which is where he was limited in the sense of getting the attraction or the word I want not with me.
You from the side.
Yeah, he's doing Alright, here lies the body of Rachel, the daughter of Jacob. Oh, first we're coming here.
Generation and
See,
generation.
we have Hebrew, Portuguese, and English. So you didn't knew this existed, Hector?
I never know you have a place for me.
So that's over from footwear and buried in here. And they used to come across the water because Jews had to bury their dead before. So that's why they used to bring them across here. And this was the nearest point.
You have a cemetery. Calvary Cemetery. You have a Calvary Cemetery.
Yeah, that's the Catholic cemetery.
Who is here? Remember!
Yeah.
This is Moses Henriquez's wife. This is her tombstone, buried. I know. What does that mean?
The Jewish year.
We should be there on the 7th. Right on.
Then we first the trip. Right here. See? No, Max,
I have no idea. That's something that
So it's best to make the book more. You've got to actually what His name's Hector.
It's ready now.
Now, Karen, you've got what you wanted. We can head back now. Yeah, you can tell them to buy a drink.
Like I said, a lot of people from all over the country, different countries come here.
Yeah.
Now that you know where you're going.
Dave, we're ready to go now.
Yeah, man, ready, man.
Action.
speak. Okay, here we go. So, Mr. Henriquez, please spell your name for me.
My name is Ainsley Henriquez, but my real name is Kenneth Ainsley Cohen Henriquez, and my Hebrew name is Avraham Ben Emmanuel HaKohen. Now, I spell Kenneth in the normal way, Kenneth. Ainsley is spelled Ainsley. Cohen is Cohen, and Henriquez is an old Portuguese name spelled Henriques.
Thank you. And I know you have a long bio. If you could give me at least 3 of your titles, will you tell me them?
You know, one of the difficulties I have is to talk about who I am and who I was. I was an agriculturalist. I grew up on a plantation. In my latter days, I spent 44 years on government boards. I was privileged to be the chairman of the Jamaica National Heritage Trust, but I've also been the president of the synagogue. I board member for 40 years, and in addition to that, before all of that, I was a member of the vice president of the B'nai B'rith for District 23, 10 countries. So I have a number of stories that I'd be happy to share with you.
Here we have running water.
No.
No?
Hmm?
I think I hear running water. I'm going to ask you once the water stops. Right? You heard the water?
Yeah.
Yeah, I knew.
Rolling and
Speed. Action.
action.
So, were you born and raised, or tell me where you were born and raised?
With a name like that, I have a number of different ancestries. My family has been in Jamaica for probably, in some instances, as much as 250 years. I grew up on a plantation outside of a town called Morant Bay, and my mother lived there until she died at 100 last year.
And last year was what year?
Last year,
She died what year?
she died in 2017.
So say my mom died in 2017. The full sentence.
And so my mother died in 2017 in where we grew up.
So, how did I meet you? I searched for Moses Cohen Henriquez. From what I learned was the most amazing Jewish pirate. And I didn't even know about Jewish pirates. So, tell me who Moses Henriquez is.
One of the interesting things of my life was to look at Jewish history. And I am a Jewish genealogist, in particular for Jamaica. So part of the exciting background comes out of the history of a man named Moses Henriquez Hacohen. And he was, or is known as the perhaps most successful Jewish pirate of the 17th century. He started ostensibly with the coming out of Holland, because that's where most of the Jews that settled in the Caribbean came from. Originally Portuguese, but they were kicked out of Portugal, or they managed to leave Portugal and then return to Judaism, as many of them were conversos. And Moses Cohen was probably of that ilk. More than likely, he was a converso that returned to Judaism. And as a result of his working with the Dutch, he became a very successful buccaneer, in that he was part of the group and perhaps major player in the group that captured a Spanish fleet in 1628. And the loot at that particular voyage is supposed to have been, in today's terms, up over $1 billion. Am I descended from Moses Cohen Henriquez? Es posible. But I don't know for certain. We'd have to do a DNA.
But you certainly know all the history.
That's why you brought me here.
Yes. And what about his relationship with Admiral Piet?
Yes.
Time?
The Dutch admiral, yes. Moses Henriquez didn't act independently. He worked with the Dutch admiral Piet, and I can't pronounce the rest of it, which was that particular effort to find the Spanish fleet, which had the loot. And what is the story of the Spanish, of the Caribbean and Latin America, was simply that from that fellow Columbus discovered Jamaica, or the Caribbean, or rather we discovered him, then the Spanish really allowed no Jews to settle in the New World. The Spanish New World was kept for the Spanish, and their main interest was to gather silver and gold, which built the Spanish Empire, which in its sense also created the Armada, which attacked Britain. We won't go into that because that's not Caribbean history and it's not Jewish history. But that is part of what the whole story was about. And as a result of that, the English in particular, also the other European nations, also wanted to attack the Spanish fleets of gold and silver going back from the mines of this New World to the Spanish Empire.
How did Moses know about the,
Roll in and action.
so two questions. How did Moses know about the treasures, about this? Was he out for, you tell me in your words, was he out for treasures? Was he out for revenge? What was he out for? What was he? What was he? What was
His motive.
his motivation for Moses Henriquez? Tell me, and also if you could share with me the difference between a pirate and a pirateer.
Moses, working with the Dutch admiral, I think was based on a number of different motivations. First of all, as I indicated, the Spanish New World did not allow Jews in the New World. So there was a concept of how could we find ways and means of removing the Spanish from the New World and giving us an opportunity to have another place we could settle. Because at the time of the beginning of the 17th century, Jews were still not allowed in most of Europe. So it was only in Amsterdam and in Holland with the Reformation that Jews were able to return to their religion. Before that they were known as conversos or anusim. Anusim means the forced ones. So Jews were actually forcibly baptized in Portugal in 1497. So most of the Jews, or those who came out of Portugal, were in effect conversos. So they had a lot of chutzpah to find ways and means in which they could continue to return to Judaism, practice Judaism. And many of them practiced Judaism in secret. When they got to Amsterdam, they were able to open, and after the beginning of the 17th century, they were able to open their lives to return to Judaism. I can tell you that story, but it could take another 20 minutes because it's a fascinating story. And where did they get their Judaism knowledge from? Because you're 2, 3 generations, 4 generations outside of practicing Judaism in Portugal. Anyway, so Moses, I think, returns to Judaism and has the energy to say enough is enough. So courage, revenge, and all of these emotions come into the front for the next 100 or more years. In fact, possibly even in Jamaica until 1831, when we were first given full citizenship, even though we arrived here from 1655. So it's a fascinating story that evolves. It's not just one person, it's a number of people. And some of us became privateers. These are private people running their own ships and in fact seeking the goods from Spanish or other vessels that are traveling back and forth to Europe. So privateers is one part of it. You also have buccaneers. And the English worked with buccaneers when they captured Jamaica because buccaneers were the people who became pirates. They were given letters of marque. They were official in the sense that they went out to attack other European nations who were at war or not necessarily in light or in working with the English. It's a great story because it's only after the Treaty of Madrid in 1670 that the English and the Spanish, or the English withdrew the letters of marque, so that the buccaneers now became pirates. The same people became pirates. So we changed their title, if you wish. They continued their same activity, but we changed their title. They became pirates. Were Jews involved? Certainly. Were Jews involved only on the sea? No. I am of the view that a lot of the mercantilism that Jews practiced in Port Royal and in the early days in Spanish Town, because before Kingston was founded in 1692 in Jamaica, was the purchase of the captured goods and the sale of the captured goods. So in a context, we have to recognize that Port Royal, after 1655, when the English captured Jamaica, became the major entrepot in the New World. And the sunken city of Port Royal is perhaps one of the three most important sunken facilities, sites in the world that tell the story of the 17th century. So it's all part of an understanding that some of us Jews have really researched and emerged from with the knowledge that this was part of what we did, with that chutzpah, with that sense of revenge, with that creating a new world where we could flourish and we could practice Judaism freely.
Perfect.
Rolling and looking at our action.
Port Royal actually sank because of an earthquake, and one could argue that there was so much loot that it caused Port Royal to sink, but I wouldn't necessarily take that too seriously.
Okay. Thank you. What is it that one?
Rolling
We're rolling.
and action.
I think that if we return to Moses, Henriques HaKohen, and his brother Jacob, they returned to Jamaica certainly in the 1660s, and they were searching for the Columbus gold mine, and that's not to be forgotten. One of the great aspects of the motivation for our author that wrote The Jewish Pirates of the Caribbean, my dear friend Ed Critchlow, was to find a gold mine. I think we eventually discovered and determined that the gold was in the story, not in the mine.
That's the best soundbite I could ever get. God, for
And let me add that we actually found a document.
Fritz,
Fritz.
rolling and action.
And we actually found a document in the Jamaican archives signed by Charles II giving the Henriques brothers permission to search for the Columbus gold mine. So this is not a fairy tale. This is real stuff.
And I wonder, well, also tell me the story about Jamaica being a safe haven for Jews to pray. I shared with you about having the mezuzah in front of Mother Mary to go in and
Not here. That's in Spain.
it's in Spain. But tell me to what level, okay, did the Jews have to pray in secrecy, which is now going to lead us to the synagogue, why is there sand on the floor in your synagogue, and how many synagogues are like that in the
No,
world?
we're getting all over the place
I know.
now. We're a little bit. So let's go back to Port Royal, and let us recognize that when the English captured Jamaica, it was primarily because of the massive harbor that Kingston enjoys. Kingston Harbor is the 7th largest in the world. And so with the protection that the English built to stop foreign ships coming into Kingston Harbor, this was what attracted Jews to the major public works and of course the business of the shipping capture the capture of the Spanish fleets or other shipping for that matter, by the buccaneers, who were licensed by the English. Now, interestingly, the English did not allow the Catholics to practice Catholicism in Jamaica, but every other religion was free to practice. In fact, there's a wonderful story that the Quakers didn't die in the earthquake in 1692 because they were at a meeting in Spanish Town. So that's part of the story. Did Jews die in that earthquake? Yes. Where are they buried? Some of them are buried in the Hunts Bay Cemetery, which was created before 1672, because that's the only place they could bury the dead. They couldn't bury them in Port Royal. The water table was too high, or the earth was too close to the water. They couldn't get a proper grave. So that's why Port Royal is the oldest Jewish cemetery in Jamaica. So let's, moving forward, we were not then restricted from practicing Judaism when we built a synagogue in Port Royal, which is underwater today. Probably the second oldest synagogue in the Western Hemisphere. Only older by the synagogue which has now been found in Recife. So this is all part of the fascinating nearly 400-year history of the Caribbean with Jews. So what happens after that? After the earthquake, we were able to spread across the country. The English established the plantation system. Sugar became the major product for sale to Europe, as it was in Brazil. But we were hundreds of thousands of miles closer to Europe, so it was much less expensive to become one of the major sugar producers in the world. And yes, slavery was established for the purposes of growing sugar. And yes, Jews were allowed to own a certain limited number of slaves. And we really didn't engage in the plantation system. We were much more involved in mercantilism, and the English even complained to the king that we were taking away their business. Why we were so active was partly because we were literate, partly because we had cousins and uncles and aunts that had settled in other parts of the world where they were allowed, such as the establishment of the colonies in the United States, such as England allowing Jews to return to England after 1654, the capture of Jamaica, because they had been expelled from 1290. So these are all part and parcels of a fascinating set of stories which has only really come to light in the last 2 decades.
Going back to Jamaica and the note.
Not yet, no. Okay. But hold on a second. Ainsley, I want you to finish the synagogue issue.
With what?
The synagogue, the story on the synagogue, and the importance of the synagogue, and then bring the sand into it.
Okay. No problem.
Okay.
So the islands that allowed Jews to practice were the Dutch and the English islands. And part of what we built in our synagogues was to put sand on the floor. And the legend is that it was to remind us that we were practicing Judaism in secret in the cellars, so that the footsteps would be muffled if the inquisitors came into the building to search for us. And the other part of the legend is that we should multiply like sand on the seashore. So that's part of the legends, because there's nothing rabbinical, there's no Talmudic response to the idea that we should have sand on our floor. And there were 5 Jewish synagogues in the Caribbean that have sand on the floor. So it's a fascinating story. That we were able to actually openly worship was a given. But the fact is that we did have synagogues which had sand on the floor, and still do.
And that's what people need to see, to be reminded of this time,
Yeah.
I feel. But like you would say, that's another story.
It's another story because, in a sense, what happens is that the Sephardim,
Yeah.
those of Spanish and Portuguese origin, most went back into the Middle East after the expulsion of 1492. Those who became our ancestors in the Caribbean were people primarily who were converted in Portugal and eventually emerged from Portugal.